Linda, I want you to remember the coat closet. The one by your front door, the one you kept locked for good coats only. That's where you sent my wife to hang her jacket the second we walked in on Christmas Eve, before you'd even said hello to her. You didn't think I noticed. I noticed everything that night, Linda. I noticed it the way you notice a crack in a window right before it splits, quiet, then all at once. You called her trash. Right there, in front of your sister, in front of the kids, over an argument so small I still can't tell you what it was actually about. Something about the mashed potatoes being made wrong. Something that shouldn't have survived past the first bite. But you took it and you built a case out of it. And by the time you were done, you were pointing at the door and telling us to get out of your house on Christmas Eve like we were strangers who'd wandered in off the street. We left without a word. I want you to sit with that part, Linda, because I know it confused you more than anything else that night. You expected me to argue. You expected the version of me you'd built in your head over 30-some years. The one who explains himself, who softens things, who makes sure you're comfortable even when you've just humiliated the person I promised to spend my life with. That version of me didn't show up that night. I helped my wife with her coat, the good one, from the locked closet, because I'd unlocked it myself years ago and you never noticed that either. And we walked out into the cold without saying a single word back to you. By morning you were begging on the phone. I'm not going to pretend that surprised me as much as it probably should have. I've been waiting for a night like that one for longer than I want to admit. You never asked why my wife got quiet every time we drove to your house. You never asked why she started keeping her coat on for the first 20 minutes of every visit, like she was leaving herself an exit. You assumed that was just her personality, reserved, a little cold, not family the way you meant the word. You called her a bit much to my sister once, thinking it wouldn't get back to me. It did. Everything gets back to me eventually, Linda. That's something you never quite learned about your son. You never asked what it cost me every month to keep your lights on. You called it help, like it was something I offered out of the goodness of my heart, and you graciously accepted. You never once asked if it was hard for me. You never asked if my wife and I had conversations at our kitchen table about a budget that always had a Linda-shaped hole cut out of it before anything else got paid. You assumed the money just existed, the way you assumed I'd always be standing there to catch whatever you dropped. You called yourself a good mother at that dinner table, right before you turned on my wife. You said it like a fact nobody was allowed to question. I raised him right. I gave him everything, and my wife just sat there, taking it, because she'd learned a long time ago that arguing with you in your own house was like arguing with weather. You never asked her what she thought a good mother-in-law might look like. You never asked her much of anything, actually. You talked at her. You talked about her, sometimes in the same room, like she couldn't hear you if you just didn't make eye contact. You never saw the two houses we were living between, Linda, yours, warm and paid for, and ours, where we did the actual math every month to make that possible. You never saw my wife stay up late doing that math with me, never complaining, just quietly making room for a mother-in-law who called her trash and meant it. You never saw what restraint looks like from the outside, because you'd never had to practice it yourself. You assumed the arrangement was permanent. That's the word I keep coming back to, permanent. Like it was owed to you. Like 30 years of being your son came with a lifetime service contract I'd signed without reading the fine print. You never asked if it was fair. Fair wasn't a word you used much when it came to yourself. I started keeping a ledger, Linda. Not the kind with numbers, though there was plenty of that too. Every payment, every just this once that turned into every month. Every time you called needing something, and I moved my own plans to make sure you had it. This was a different ledger. This one tracked something quieter. Every time you looked past my wife like she was furniture. Every time you cut her off mid-sentence at a family dinner. Every backhanded compliment about her cooking, her job, her family, delivered with a smile so nobody else in the room would catch what you'd actually done. I was counting, Linda. You had no idea I was counting. I didn't say anything for a long time. That was the strategy, if you want to call it that, not silence out of weakness, but silence because I was done handing you material to work with. Every time I used to push back, you'd turn it into a story about how ungrateful I'd become, how my wife had changed me, how you'd sacrificed everything, and this was the thanks you got. So I stopped giving you the argument. I just started quietly building something you couldn't see. I moved money first. Slowly, so you wouldn't notice the shape of it changing. An emergency fund that used to funnel straight into your accounts started staying in mine instead. I told you it was tight this month more than once. And you believed me, because it had never occurred to you that I might be the one deciding what tight meant. You never once asked where that money actually was. You just assumed it would show up again, the way it always had. I talked to my wife every night about it. Actually talked, the kind of conversation you never once had with her. She didn't ask me to cut you off. I want you to know that, Linda, because I know you'll want a villain in this story who isn't me, and you'll reach for her first. She never asked for that. What she asked for, quietly, more than once, was just to be seen as someone who mattered in that house. That's all. You couldn't even manage that. I started pulling back from the family group chat, the calls, the just checking in visits that always turned into you needing something by the end of them. You noticed that part. You mentioned it once, said I'd gotten distant, said it like an accusation instead of a question. You didn't ask why. You never asked why, Linda. That's the whole story of us, if I'm honest. You were never big on the asking. I started saving the messages too. The comments about my wife's weight. The comment about her not really being family since we didn't have kids yet. The comment at my cousin's wedding about how you hoped I'd come to my senses eventually. I wasn't collecting them to use as weapons. I was collecting them because some part of me knew that one day I'd need to remember that this had been happening for years, not just on one bad Christmas Eve. The ledger kept growing, and you never once looked over my shoulder to see what was in it. By the time Christmas Eve came around, I wasn't the man who used to sit quietly and absorb whatever you said about my wife. I just hadn't told you that yet. You stood in your dining room and called my wife trash. You said it loud enough for your sister to hear, loud enough for the kids at the other table to go quiet, loud enough that there was no version of that moment where you could later claim it was a joke or an exaggeration. You told us to get out of your house. On Christmas Eve, over mashed potatoes. I want you to sit in that moment again, Linda, because I've replayed it more times than you probably think I have. You expected me to apologize for her. That's what always happened before. I'd smooth it over, tell her later that you didn't mean it, ask her to give you the benefit of the doubt one more time. Instead, I stood up, and I helped her with her coat, and I looked at you, and I didn't say a single word. You didn't know what to do with silence from me. You never had to. We drove home, without talking much. My wife cried for maybe 10 minutes, and then she stopped, and I remember thinking that was the last time. That was the last Christmas Eve you were ever going to get the chance to do that to her. By morning, you were calling. Not to apologize at first. I want to be honest about that, because I know you'd like this story to start with your apology, and it didn't. It started with you asking if I could send the usual transfer early because you'd had an unexpected expense. You were calling about money the morning after you called my wife trash and threw us out of your house. That's who you are when nobody's watching, Linda. That's the version of you I'd been quietly documenting the whole time. I told you there wasn't going to be a transfer. Not early, not late, not this month, not the ones after it. I told you, calmly, the way I'd practiced saying it 100 times in my head over the years without ever actually saying it out loud, that I wasn't going to keep fixing problems for someone who couldn't manage 5 minutes of decency toward my wife. You went quiet. You went quiet the way I used to go quiet, and I think that's when it actually landed, not the words, but the fact that I meant them, and that I wasn't going to take them back by dinner time the way I always used to. You called again that afternoon, and the next day, and the day after that, when the expense turned out to be smaller than you'd made it sound, which told me everything I needed to know about how much of it had ever been real. You told me you didn't mean what you said about my wife. You told me you'd had too much wine, that the holidays make everyone tense, that surely I understood family gets messy sometimes. You never once said her name in any of those calls. Not once, Linda. You could apologize for the scene, but you couldn't quite bring yourself to apologize to her. That's when I told you the rest of it. That the money wasn't coming back, not because I couldn't afford it anymore, but because I finally understood I'd been paying for something that was never going to change unless it cost you something. That the invitations weren't coming either, not until you could sit at a table with my wife and treat her like she belonged there, because she does, whether you've ever managed to see it or not. You should have listened years ago, Linda. You didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in longer than I can remember, you didn't have a story ready, a version of events where you came out looking like the good mother who'd given everything and gotten nothing back. Because for once, the numbers were right there, and they didn't say what you wanted them to say. It's been months now. You've called less. When you do call, you ask about her before you ask about anything else. A habit so new I almost don't believe it when I hear it, but I let it stand anyway, because I'm curious to see if it lasts longer than a season. There's no lights bill with your name quietly attached to it anymore. There's no emergency fund waiting to become yours the second you needed it. What's left is smaller, slower, and it has to be earned back one real conversation at a time, the same way anything worth having usually does. My wife still keeps her coat on for the first few minutes when we visit family now, old habits taking their time to unlearn themselves. But she doesn't keep it on around you anymore, because you don't get to be in the room until she decides she's ready. And for the first time in our marriage, that decision is entirely hers to make, not mine to manage on your behalf. I used to think loyalty meant absorbing whatever you did and calling it love. I don't think that anymore, Linda. I think loyalty means choosing who gets protected when the room turns on someone. And for years I chose you by default, out of habit, out of guilt, out of 30 years of being your son before I ever got the chance to be anyone else's husband. I don't choose by default anymore. You called her trash on Christmas Eve, Linda, and you told us to leave your house. We left, and we didn't come back the way we used to, quietly, apologetically, ready to make it easy for you to forget it ever happened. We came back on our own terms, or we didn't come back at all, and either way, the choosing was finally mine. If this one hit close to home for you, if you've ever had to decide between keeping the peace and protecting the person you love, I want to hear it. Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because there are a lot more of these stories still to come.